Rome did not sleep because it was tired, it slept because darkness demanded it, and in that darkness the city woke once more, not to work, not to panic, but to pause, breathe, pray, whisper, and exist quietly between two sleeps that history no longer remembers. If these quiet stories of the past help your breathing slow and your thoughts soften into the night, you are always welcome to remain here. Subscribing gently supports long-form storytelling without noise, urgency, or performance. It helps protect this calm space where history moves at its own pace and speaks in a low voice. Your presence allows more evenings like this to exist, more patience, more stillness, more careful listening. There is no rush. Return whenever the world feels too loud. We will be here, quietly waiting. Rome did not sleep through the night. Rome did not stay awake late, and it did not sleep straight through either. That idea belongs to another world, a brighter one, a louder one, a world with switches on the wall and glowing numbers beside the bed. Medieval Rome had none of that. It had darkness, real darkness, the kind that does not politely wait outside your window, but enters the room, settles into the corners, and quietly informs you that the day is over. In medieval Rome, night was not something you filled. It was something you surrendered to. When the sun slipped behind the hills and the last light drained out of the stone streets, the city did not debate whether to stay up a little longer. There was no just one more thing, no endless scroll, no soft electric glow convincing the body that it was still afternoon. When night arrived, Rome accepted it, calmly, practically, without drama. Oil lamps existed, of course, candles too, but they were not cheap and they were never bright. Every flame was a calculation. Every extra minute of light was fuel burned, money gone, air thickened with smoke. And so most homes chose the sensible option. They went to bed early, not because they were virtuous, not because they were disciplined, but because darkness made the decision for them. The streets emptied quickly, doors closed, shutters were drawn tight, not for comfort, but for warmth and safety. Rome's houses were cold. Stone always is. Damp, too, especially near the river. The walls held the chill long after sunset, and the floors never quite warmed. Winter or summer, night carried moisture with it. You felt it in your bones, not dramatically, just persistently, like a quiet reminder that this was not a city built for softness. So people lay down. Families gathered into shared beds or onto straw pallets near the hearth. Privacy was minimal. Silence was rare. Someone coughed, someone shifted. Someone's stomach growled, ignored. The house breathed as one body settling into rest. And soon sleep came, quickly, deeply, not the fragile, negotiated sleep of modern nights, but a heavy, decisive descent into darkness. This was the first sleep. It mattered more than the rest. Medieval people did not know about REM cycles or brain chemistry, but they understood this intuitively. The first sleep was when the body truly shut down, when the ache in the shoulders softened, when the long day of carrying water, grinding grain, repairing walls, tending animals, arguing with neighbors, and surviving Rome loosened its grip. This was the sleep that repaired you, the sleep that counted. And then, hours later, something happened. No bell rang, no voice called out, no alarm shattered the quiet. There was simply a moment when eyes opened, fully, not confused, not panicked, just awake. If you woke at 2 in the morning in Rome in the year 1300, you did not reach for medicine. You did not worry that something was wrong. You did not lie there mentally calculating how many hours of sleep you had left. You did not whisper the word insomnia to yourself like a diagnosis. You were simply on time. This waking was expected, anticipated even. The body rose naturally out of the deep first sleep and entered a lighter, quieter state. A pause, a breath, the space between. Medieval people had names for it. The watch, the vigil, the middle of the night, the hour that did not belong to yesterday or tomorrow. The house was still dark, darker in some ways than before. The fire had burned low, reduced to embers that barely outlined the shapes of furniture. The air was cold again. Breath showed faintly even indoors. Outside, the city was silent in a way that feels unfamiliar now. No traffic, no hum, no distant machines, just stone, sky, and the occasional sound of someone else being awake at the same time you were. You did not rush to fill this hour. There was nothing urgent waiting. No one expected productivity. Rome was not impressed by busyness at night. This time was not for proving anything. Some people prayed, not loudly, not ceremonially, just a few murmured words learned by repetition more than understanding. Others tended the fire, adding a small log, careful not to waste wood. Someone checked the door bar. Someone listened for footsteps outside. Not because danger was constant, but because it was possible, and that was enough. Many simply sat. They let their thoughts wander in a way daylight never allowed. The day was for labor, for obligation, for performance. The night, especially this hour, belonged to honesty. Worries surfaced here, regrets, hopes, the quiet kind, the ones that did not need solutions, only acknowledgement. Sometimes there was conversation. Low voices shared between spouses, between parents, between people who had already done everything the day demanded of them. These were not dramatic talks, no speeches, no resolutions, just fragments, observations, half-finished thoughts, the sort of conversation that drifts and pauses and does not mind silence. Rome did not rush these moments. There was no clock watching you. Time itself felt different, stretched thin, less concerned with progress. The city was not asleep exactly, but it was not awake in the modern sense either. It was resting in stages, moving gently through the night, instead of forcing itself through it. And then, without ceremony, the body signaled again. The vigil ended the same way it began. Quietly, eyelids grew heavy, muscles softened. The bench by the hearth no longer felt like a place to sit, but a place to leave. People returned to their beds, to their pallets, to their shared warmth and familiar discomforts. There was no struggle, no insistence on staying awake. Sleep arrived again, lighter this time, but still welcome. This was the second sleep. It carried the city toward dawn, toward roosters and bells and the return of obligation. It was not as deep as the first sleep, but it was enough. Enough to rise again, enough to work, enough to continue. Rome lived like this for centuries. Not because it was traditional, not because it was religious, but because it made sense in a world where darkness was real, where nights were long, and where the human body had not yet been trained to pretend otherwise. Only much later would this rhythm disappear. Later, when light became cheap, when night could be pushed back with glass and gas and wires, when work schedules stopped caring about bodies and started caring about output, when waking at 2 a.m. became a problem instead of a pause. But in medieval Rome, there was no anxiety attached to that moment, no fear of being broken, no sense that something needed fixing. If you woke at 2 a.m, you were not failing at sleep, you were participating in it. And Rome, ancient and patient, was awake with you. Rome in those hours was not impressive, and it did not try to be. There were no grand scenes unfolding in the middle of the night, no speeches, no history being made, just stone walls cooling down, breath turning faintly white, and people doing small things that mattered precisely because they were small. This is something modern stories often miss. Rome at night did not perform. It did not glow. It did not ask to be remembered. It simply existed quietly between one obligation and the next. The vigil was not a rebellion against sleep. It was part of it. Bodies were not confused by this rhythm. They were not fighting themselves. They were following something older than instruction, older than habit, something that had formed long before clocks decided what time meant, long before anyone expected 8 uninterrupted hours of unconsciousness as proof of a successful night. In medieval Rome, no one lay awake counting minutes. No one stared at the ceiling rehearsing tomorrow's failures. If you were awake, you accepted it. You adjusted. You moved softly so as not to wake others, or you stayed still and let the moment pass over you. Even the city itself seemed to cooperate. Rome's streets, narrow and uneven, held the cold, but also held sound. Footsteps carried farther at night, which meant fewer of them. People moved carefully, respectfully, aware that others were resting nearby. A door closed slowly. A latch was eased into place. The night rewarded gentleness. Somewhere a watchman passed. Not dramatically, not heroically, just a familiar shape moving through the dark, checking that the world was still intact. Fires were the real danger, more than thieves. A spark left unattended could erase a street by morning, so the watch existed not to guard power, but to protect continuity, to make sure tomorrow could happen. In another house, a baker was awake because bread does not care about sleep cycles. Dough rises on its own schedule. The vigil was not restful for everyone. Some worked through it, hands deep in flour, heat from the oven the only warmth strong enough to fight the night. Their bodies adapted too, finding fragments of rest where they could, sleeping later when the city stirred. Rome allowed for this unevenness. Not everyone slept the same way. Not everyone rested at the same time. But the city did not demand uniformity. It did not insist on efficiency. It accepted that life unfolded in layers. This mattered more than anyone realized at the time, because the vigil did something subtle. It created space. Space for thought that did not need action. Space for conversation that did not need conclusions. Space for worry that did not need solving. In daylight, Rome was relentless. The city demanded work, obedience, endurance. But at night, especially in that quiet middle hour, Rome loosened its grip. People thought about things they did not say aloud during the day, about marriages that were not working, about children who worried them, about winters that felt too long and harvests that felt too thin. They did not catastrophize. They did not spiral. They simply noticed these thoughts, turned them over once or twice, and then let them drift away when sleep returned. There was a humility to this rhythm. The night did not promise answers. It offered presence. And that was enough. Modern life has trained us to fear waking up, to interpret it as failure, as interruption, as something to be corrected. Medieval Rome did the opposite. It treated waking as part of the design, something to move through, not eliminate. Even humor lived here, quietly. Someone might sigh at the cold. Someone might mutter that their joints were already arguing with tomorrow. Someone might think with mild irritation about the straw that never quite stopped poking through the bedding. These were not complaints meant to be fixed. They were acknowledgments. Small jokes shared with oneself in the dark. The night did not need to be improved. It only needed to be survived gently. And then, inevitably, it shifted again. The vigil faded, muscles softened, thoughts slowed. The body, satisfied that nothing urgent remained undone, allowed itself to sink once more. The second sleep arrived without negotiation. Lighter, shorter, a bridge, rather than a destination. This sleep carried Rome toward morning. Toward the sound of shutters opening, toward the low murmur of a city preparing to resume its visible life, toward work that did not care how you had slept, only that you showed up. But the night had done its work too. It had restored something that daylight could not, a sense of continuity. A feeling that life was not a single, uninterrupted push forward, but a series of pauses stitched together by habit and trust. Rome did not think of this as wisdom. It did not need to. The rhythm existed whether anyone reflected on it or not, like breathing, like walking, like waiting. Only later, much later, would this rhythm break. Only later would night become optional. Only later would light turn cheap and time turn sharp. Only later would waking in the dark feel like a problem instead of a pause. But here in medieval Rome, none of that had happened yet. Here, if you woke at 2 a.m, the city was not asking you to fix yourself. It was simply keeping you company. First sleep when Rome turned off the light. Evening in medieval Rome did not announce itself loudly. It did not arrive with spectacle or urgency. It simple settled. The sun slipped away behind the uneven line of hills, and the light drained slowly from the stone. Not all at once. Rome resisted the dark for a moment, the way old cities do, holding on to warmth and color just a little longer than the countryside. The walls caught the last orange glow. The rooftops softened. Then, inevitably, the shadows won. Church bells marked the transition, not dramatically but firmly. Their sound moved across the city like a reminder rather than a command. Day was finished, not defeated, just done. Work had reached its natural stopping point, not because everything was complete, but because visibility had run out. You can only do so much when you can no longer see your own hands. Wooden doors closed, one after another, along narrow streets that had already begun to empty. The sound of bolts sliding into place echoed briefly and then disappeared into the thickening quiet. Shutters followed, pulled tight against the night air. Not to shut the world out exactly, but to keep what little warmth remained from escaping. Rome after sunset became smaller. Public life withdrew indoors. Markets dissolved without ceremony. Conversations shortened, not out of rudeness but practicality. People did not linger outside once darkness took hold. Candles could light a room, barely. They could not make a street safe, and they certainly could not make it warm. Oil lamps flickered weakly behind windows, each flame a tiny, private decision. How long was the light worth keeping? A few minutes more, perhaps. Long enough to finish a bowl of stew? Long enough to say something that had been waiting all day? But not long enough to pretend night could be postponed. Eventually, even those small lights vanished. Inside the houses, families gathered close. Rome's homes were built of stone, which looked solid and eternal during the day and felt cold and uncooperative at night. Stone absorbed dampness the way it absorbed history, slowly and without apology. Floors chilled quickly. Walls held onto the cold as if it were valuable. Beds were simple, sometimes barely beds at all. Straw mattresses rested on wooden frames or directly on the floor. Over them lay thick woolen blankets, heavy and rough, smelling faintly of sheep and smoke. They scratched if you moved too much. You learned not to move too much. Comfort was not something you adjusted endlessly. You adapted to it, and then you slept. Families slept together, not out of affection, though there was that too, but because body heat mattered. Children curled where they could fit. Parents claimed the center if there was one. Privacy was theoretical. Warmth was real. The house settled. The fire, carefully banked, glowed low in the hearth, its light no longer strong enough to illuminate faces, only shapes. Breath became visible in faint clouds when someone shifted. Outside, the city quieted completely. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of synchronization. Thousands of people making the same decision at roughly the same time. It was time. The first sleep came quickly. Not gently, the way modern sleep often does, negotiated and delayed. This sleep arrived like a door closing. The body, exhausted from daylight labor, accepted the darkness without argument. Muscles loosened. The dull ache behind the shoulders faded. The mind stopped listing tasks. This was the deep sleep, the one that mattered. Medieval people did not use modern language for it, but they understood its importance. Physicians of the time believed that sleeping soon after the evening meal helped digestion. Food, they thought, settled better when the body lay still. Heat gathered in the core. Balance returned. The body repaired itself quietly while the world rested. They were not entirely wrong. The first sleep was long and heavy. Dreams, if they came at all, rarely lingered. This was not the sleep of imagination. It was the sleep of repair. The sleep that prepared you for another day of carrying water, lifting stone, arguing prices, tending animals, surviving Rome. The city entered its first true silence. No footsteps echoed in the streets. No voices rose through open windows. Even the dogs, unreliable creatures that they were, eventually gave up on barking at shadows. Rome, vast and ancient, lay still for the first time since dawn. Time passed, unnoticed. Hours slipped by without witnesses. The fire burned lower, embers dimmed from orange to red to something closer to memory than light. The air cooled again, settling into the corners of rooms, creeping under blankets, reminding bodies that warmth was temporary. And then, slowly, something shifted. Eyes opened. Not suddenly, not in fear, just awake. There was no sense of alarm in this moment, no confusion, no frustration. The waking came as naturally as the sleeping had. The body simply rose out of the deep first sleep and entered a lighter state, alert but calm. This was expected. If you lived in Rome long enough, your body learned the pattern without instruction. You did not question it. You did not try to fight it. You did not assume something had gone wrong. Waking in the middle of the night was not a failure of sleep. It was part of it. But that belonged to the next chapter. For now, Rome remained wrapped in its first rest. In these hours, nothing demanded attention. The city did not expect productivity. No one measured success by how long they stayed unconscious. Sleep was not a performance. It was a necessity, taken seriously but not dramatized. There was a subtle humility to it. Rome did not pretend it could outrun the night. It did not fill darkness with distraction. It accepted limits. When vision ended, so did activity. When energy ran out, rest followed. This rhythm shaped the city more than laws ever could. Because when you know you will sleep deeply early, you work differently during the day. You pace yourself, you finish what matters, you let smaller things go. There is no illusion that time is endless. The first sleep enforced honesty. Bodies stopped pretending to be tireless. Minds stopped pretending to be efficient. Everyone, rich or poor, noble or laborer, submitted to the same rule. Darkness arrived, and Rome lay down. There was a quiet irony in this equality. During the day, Rome was sharply divided. Status announced itself in clothing, in posture, in who gave orders and who received them. At night, under heavy blankets and shared breath, those distinctions softened. Everyone snored, everyone shifted. Everyone searched for the least pokey part of the mattress. Sleep flattened hierarchy better than any sermon. Even the wealthy, with thicker mattresses and better blankets, could not escape the cold entirely. Stone houses remained stone houses. Bodies remained bodies. No one slept untouched by damp air and gravity. Rome's greatness did not follow it into bed. And that was fine. The first sleep did not care about empire. It did not remember conquest. It did not honor monuments. It honored exhaustion, digestion, and the simple fact that humans cannot remain upright forever. As the city rested, it did not know it was participating in something ancient. No one framed this rhythm as tradition or culture. It was simply life arranged around darkness. Only centuries later would this arrangement seem strange. Only much later would people begin to force sleep into a single uninterrupted block and call anything else a disorder. Only later would waking in the night become a source of anxiety instead of a familiar pause. But here, in medieval Rome, nothing was wrong. The city slept deeply, completely, for the first time that night, and it did so without fear, without clocks, without expectations beyond survival. Rome did not glow, it did not buzz, it did not perform, it rested. And for a while, that was enough. The first sleep was not dramatic. It did not feel important while it was happening. That was part of its strength. Nothing in medieval Rome announced, "This is the sleep that repairs you." No one lay down thinking in those terms. People simply felt their bodies let go. Shoulders dropped, jaws unclenched, breath deepened without instruction. The mind stopped narrating the day and slipped into a quieter place where thoughts no longer needed to line up. The house breathed differently now. Wood settled, stone cooled. Somewhere in the building, a beam shifted, with a sound so soft it barely deserved to be called noise. Outside, the city felt farther away, as if Rome itself had taken a step back to give its people room to disappear for a while. This was not the kind of sleep you negotiated with. It took you whether you were ready or not. Children fell into it first, easily and completely, limbs slack, dreams heavy and unremembered. Adults followed soon after, slower perhaps, but no less deeply. The day had been long. It always was. There was no surplus energy to waste on restlessness. Even worry grew tired. Concerns about money, food, weather, neighbors, the coming winter, the distant rumors of politics and power all faded. Not solved, just postponed. The night did not fix things. It simply set them down until morning. Medieval medical thinking supported this rhythm without fully understanding it. Physicians spoke of balance, of humors settling, of warmth, moving inward when the body lay still. They advised against staying awake too long after eating, warned that digestion required rest, not motion. Rome listened to this advice, not because it trusted theory, but because experience confirmed it. Eat. Lie down. Sleep. The body responded well to this order. Meals were simple and heavy, meant to sustain rather than delight. Bread, pottage, wine watered down enough to avoid trouble. After eating, movement slowed naturally. No one felt inspired to pace the room looking for stimulation. There was nothing to stimulate. Darkness did that job efficiently. In the absence of light, imagination quieted. The eyes, no longer hunting for detail, gave up. The brain followed. Sleep arrived like gravity asserting itself. This first sleep wrapped the city in a shared vulnerability. No one was watching. No one was guarding appearances. Faces slackened into their true shapes. Mouths fell open. Snoring emerged without shame. The body, relieved of performance, did what it needed to do. Rome, for all its reputation, spent these hours entirely unremarkable. There were no secret meetings, no conspiracies whispered at midnight, no great plans unfolding under cover of darkness. Those things belonged to stories written later by people who needed the past to feel exciting. The truth was quieter. The truth was thousands of people lying still in stone rooms, trusting that the city would still be there when they woke. Trust mattered here. There were risks, of course. Fire never slept. Illness did not care about schedules. Night always carried the possibility of loss. But fear did not dominate the first sleep. Exhaustion did. The body chose rest over vigilance, knowing that it could not stay alert forever. That was what the vigil was for later. This sleep was about surrender. Rome understood the value of that surrender. A city that never truly rests cannot endure for long. Even empires require moments when nothing is asked of them, when the only goal is to remain alive until morning. The first sleep created that moment. As hours passed, the city sank deeper into stillness. Even those who might later wake during the vigil now lay motionless, minds blank, bodies heavy. The night stretched long and dark, but it did not press. It held. Outside, the sky turned slowly, stars moving with a patience that outlasted every human concern. Clouds drifted, wind touched rooftops and moved on. Rome did not respond. It had already committed to rest. Somewhere far off, a bell might toll the hour, meant for monks who did not sleep this way, whose nights followed a stricter rule. But most of the city did not hear it. Or if they did, it passed through sleep without leaving a mark. Time, in this state, lost its edges. There was no sense of how long one had been asleep, only the feeling of being deeply inside it, of having gone somewhere unreachable by thought. This was the first sleep at its most complete, and it mattered more than anyone ever wrote down. Because this sleep shaped mornings, it shaped patience. It shaped the ability to endure work that would otherwise grind people down too quickly. It gave the body a foundation strong enough to handle what daylight demanded. Without this deep rest, Rome would not have functioned as long as it did. The irony, gentle and almost amusing, is that no one thanked it. People thanked God for safety, for harvests, for survival. They thanked saints. They thanked luck. They rarely thanked sleep. It was too ordinary for gratitude, too reliable. It was simply there. The city did not praise the first sleep. It depended on it. And then, quietly, imperceptibly, the body began to rise again. But that belongs to the next movement of the night. For now, Rome remained still, stone breathing, fire dim, bodies heavy, thoughts absent. The city had turned off its light, and in that darkness, it rested for the first time. The first sleep did not announce its ending either. It did not fade with a signal. It did not loosen its grip all at once. It simply held on, deep and steady, long enough for the body to forget itself. In this sleep, Rome was not a city. It was weight. It was warmth, gathered under wool. It was the quiet agreement between stone walls and tired bones that nothing more would be asked tonight. No one dreamed of greatness here. No one planned tomorrow. No one rehearsed conversations or feared what had not yet happened. Those habits belonged to waking hours. The first sleep stripped them away without ceremony. This was the sleep of people who expected to wake up again later. Not yet, but soon enough. And that knowledge changed everything, because this sleep was not desperate. It was not clung to. It did not carry the panic of scarcity. Rome did not sleep as if it might never rest again. It slept, knowing there would be another pause, another quiet moment waiting further into the night. That certainty made surrender easier. Bodies sank into straw and shared warmth without holding themselves tense. Muscles did not brace for interruption. Minds did not stay half alert. The city trusted the rhythm it had always known. Stone houses, cold and patient, wrapped their occupants in silence. Streets remained empty, not because people were afraid, but because There was nowhere else to be. The world had narrowed to a room, a blanket, a breath. Somewhere, far above the rooftops, the sky continued its slow turning, but down below Rome stayed still. It did not follow the stars. It let them pass. The first sleep asked nothing of the city. And the city, grateful without knowing it, gave everything to it. Hours passed this way, uncounted, unmeasured. The fire faded to memory. The air cooled just enough to remind bodies they were alive, not enough to wake them. Breath found a rhythm and stayed there. Even discomfort softened into background noise, something the body acknowledged and then ignored. This was rest before awareness. Rest before thought. Rest before self. And in that state, Rome endured. Not because it was powerful, not because it was eternal, but because it knew when to stop. When the day had taken all it could, the city lay down and did not argue. It did not try to stretch time. It did not resist darkness. It allowed itself to be unremarkable for a while. That, more than monuments or memory, was how Rome lasted. The first sleep wrapped the city whole, street by street, house by house, body by body. And for a while nothing moved, nothing needed to. Rome had turned off its light. And in that deep, shared stillness, the night held its breath, waiting for the next, quieter awakening to arrive. The Vigil. When Rome woke. In the middle of the night. The waking did not arrive with urgency. It did not pull Rome out of sleep the way fear does. It arrived the way breath returns after a long pause, quietly, without instruction, without surprise. Somewhere between 3 and 4 hours after night had fully taken hold, eyes opened across the city. Not all at once, not in unison, but close enough that the rhythm felt shared. There were no clocks to consult, no glowing faces on walls, no numbers to explain what was happening. Medieval Rome did not measure the night in minutes. It measured it in sensation, in the weight of the blanket, in the temperature of the air, in the way the body shifted from deep heaviness into a lighter, alert stillness. People did not ask what time it was. They asked nothing at all. The body already knew. The room was still dark, darker than evening in fact. The fire had burned down to a suggestion of itself, a faint ember glow that barely traced the outline of familiar objects. Tables became shadows, walls dissolved into darkness. Faces were invisible even to those who shared the same bed. Yet no one panicked. Darkness was not an emergency. It was the expected condition of night. This moment, this waking, was called the Vigil. Not because it demanded vigilance in the modern sense, not because everyone sprang into alertness, scanning for danger. The word meant something quieter. It meant being present. It meant being awake without urgency. It meant holding the night rather than fighting it. Rome did not treat this waking as a mistake. No one whispered the word insomnia as if it explained something broken. No one lay rigid, insisting that sleep must resume immediately or the next day would collapse. The vigil was not a problem to solve. It was a phase to pass through. People lay still for a moment after waking, listening to the sound of breath in the room, to the faint creak of wood settling, to the distant, nearly imagined noises of a city that was not entirely asleep, only paused. The body took inventory without anxiety. Cold? A little. Thirst? Sometimes. Hunger? Rarely, but not unheard of. All of this was noted calmly, the way one notices weather. If someone rose, they did so slowly. Not because they were tired, but because speed served no purpose here. Feet found the floor carefully. The cold was immediate, sharp enough to wake the rest of the body fully. It was not unpleasant exactly. Just honest. A hand reached for a cloak, another for a bench by the hearth. Someone stirred the embers with a stick, adding a small piece of wood just enough to coax a little warmth back into the room. Flames were kept modest. Fire was valuable. Fire was dangerous. Fire was not something you indulged without reason. This was not the hour for activity in the modern sense. The vigil was not for productivity. It was for maintenance, for checking that doors were barred, that animals were quiet, that the fire would last until morning. These were not dramatic acts. They were habits, practiced so often they required almost no thought. Some prayed, not loudly, not theatrically, just enough to acknowledge the night. The Roman Christian tradition placed meaning in these hours, inherited and adapted from older rhythms. Midnight prayer was considered potent not because it was mystical, but because it was undistracted. The world was silent enough to hear oneself think, and that was rare. Others did not pray at all. They sat, they thought, or they didn't. The vigil did not demand reflection. It permitted it. What mattered was that no one rushed back to sleep out of fear. There was no sense that being awake meant something had gone wrong. On the contrary, forcing sleep would have felt unnatural. The body had completed the first sleep. It was no longer asking for rest. It was asking for stillness with awareness. Rome understood the difference. The city itself mirrored this state. Streets remained dark and empty, but they were not abandoned. Somewhere a watchman moved through them, his steps slow and deliberate. His presence was not reassuring in a dramatic way. It was reassuring in a mundane one. Someone was awake. Someone was paying attention. The night was being held. This was the deeper function of the vigil. Not alertness, but continuity. It reminded people that the world did not disappear when they slept. It also reminded them that they did not need to control it every moment. A balance existed. A sharing of responsibility between rest and awareness. In this hour, conversation changed. Words spoken during the vigil were different from those spoken during the day. They were softer, slower, less defended. No one was trying to persuade anyone. No one was performing intelligence or authority. The dark stripped those instincts away. A husband and wife might speak quietly about something that had been hovering unspoken for days, not with solutions, just acknowledgement. A worry shared became lighter without being resolved. A thought expressed lost its sharpness. Children sometimes woke too, restless or curious. They were soothed, not shushed. The vigil was not treated as an intrusion. It was folded gently into the night. A child who woke was simply awake. Nothing more. The absence of precise time mattered deeply here. Because there was no clock, there was no countdown, no pressure to measure how long one had been awake. The vigil lasted as long as it lasted, sometimes minutes, sometimes an hour or two. The body, not the schedule, decided when it was complete. This lack of measurement prevented panic. Modern anxiety about waking at night comes largely from numbers, from knowing exactly how long one has been awake, from calculating the consequences. Medieval Rome had no such arithmetic. There was only sensation, and sensation was rarely catastrophic. Eventually, without announcement, the body shifted again. Eyelids grew heavy. Thoughts thinned out. The bench by the fire stopped feeling like a place to sit and started feeling like a place to leave. People returned to their beds, not because they were told to, but because the body had finished what it came to do. The second sleep waited patiently. It did not compete with the vigil. It followed it. This rhythm, repeated night after night, shaped Rome in subtle ways. It trained people to trust their bodies, to accept pauses, to understand that rest did not need to be continuous to be effective. The vigil also taught restraint. It discouraged the kind of frantic overthinking that comes from trying to control sleep. It reminded people that wakefulness was not failure. It was simply another state, one that could be inhabited quietly and then released. Rome did not romanticize this hour. It did not write poems about it. It did not build rituals around it beyond what was necessary. The vigil did not need explanation to exist. It functioned because the night was long and light was scarce, and the human body had not yet been trained to resist itself. Only later would this hour disappear. Only later would people come to fear it, to label it, to medicate it away. Only later would waking in the night feel like a betrayal by one's own body. Here in medieval Rome, the vigil was neutral, neither good nor bad, just present. And presence, in a world that demanded so much endurance, was a quiet gift. The city rested in layers: sleep, waking, sleep again. No struggle, no confusion, just movement through darkness with a kind of unspoken agreement. Rome did not wake in the night because it was anxious. It woke because that was how nights worked, and the city, ancient and patient, accepted that without comment. The vigil did not belong to any single class of people. It did not ask who you were during the day. It did not care whether you owned land or rented a room, whether you prayed in Latin or barely prayed at all. When the body woke, it woke the same way for everyone, gently, without explanation. In that hour, Rome felt strangely equal. The wealthy were not protected from wakefulness. Thick walls and heavier blankets could not prevent the body from lifting itself into awareness. The poor, already accustomed to discomfort, found nothing alarming in it. For both, the night offered the same dim room, the same cold air, the same slow breath, returning to consciousness. What changed was not the waking itself, but how it was held. Some people lay still, eyes open, letting thoughts drift in loose, unfinished shapes. Not memories exactly, not plans either, just impressions. The sound of the river, imagined rather than heard. The weight of the coming day, acknowledged without resistance. These thoughts did not loop. They passed through, unchallenged. Others rose and moved quietly through the house, guided more by memory than sight. Hands found familiar objects in the dark: the bench, the cloak, the door bar, The motions were practiced, gentle, never rushed. Speed was unnecessary here. There was nothing to gain by finishing quickly. The vigil stretched time without making it heavy. In this hour, people did not count how long they had been awake. They did not worry about wasting rest. They trusted that sleep would return when it was ready. This trust softened everything. It kept the mind from tightening around itself. It allowed wakefulness to be calm instead of sharp. The city supported this calm. Rome's streets, empty and dark, did not invite wandering. They discouraged it, not through fear, but through indifference. There was nothing to see, nothing to do, no spectacle waiting to be discovered. The night was not entertainment. It was a condition. Those who moved outside did so with purpose. Watchmen followed familiar routes, marking time by habit rather than hours. Bakers worked by feel, not schedule, knowing when dough was ready without looking at the sky. Their nights were shaped by necessity, but even necessity moved slowly here. Inside the houses, conversation during the vigil was rare, but when it happened, it was different. Words spoken in the dark did not compete with daylight concerns. They did not need to persuade or defend. They were offered softly, sometimes clumsily, often without conclusion. A worry spoken aloud lost its weight. A shared silence felt complete rather than awkward. There was room for humor, too. Quiet humor. The kind that never rises above a breath. Someone might comment on the cold with mild irritation. Someone else might respond that the cold was at least honest. A body complaining about age was met, not with reassurance, but acceptance. These were jokes without punchlines, meant only to acknowledge the body's presence. The vigil allowed this gentleness because it had no audience. No one was being watched. No one was expected to perform competence or strength. In the dark, even confidence rested. This mattered more than it seemed. Because a city that allows its people to be unguarded, even briefly, creates a kind of resilience no law can enforce. The vigil gave Rome that space. It allowed the mind to reset without forcing it into silence. It allowed awareness without urgency. Eventually, though, the body began to signal again. Not loudly, not insistently, just a gradual softening. The bench grew less inviting. The cold felt sharper. Thoughts slowed until they lost shape altogether. The vigil had done its work, whatever that work was. People did not resist this shift. They returned to their beds without ceremony, without reflection. There was no sense of ending. The vigil did not conclude. It dissolved. Sleep followed naturally, lighter now, closer to the surface, but still restful. The city moved toward dawn without rushing it, toward roosters and bells, and the return of visible life. But something had changed. The night had been acknowledged, held, allowed. Rome did not fear the dark because it did not demand too much from it. It let the night be long. It let waking be part of rest. It did not compress human rhythms into something unnatural. This was the quiet intelligence of medieval life, rarely praised, often misunderstood. The vigil was not wisdom passed down through teaching. It was wisdom practiced through habit, a way of living that accepted interruption without panic, pause without judgment. Only much later would people forget this. Only later would waking at night become a source of anxiety rather than familiarity. Only later would darkness feel like something to escape instead of something to move through gently. Here in medieval Rome, the vigil belonged exactly where it was. Between two sleeps, between 2 days, between effort and effort again. And the city, ancient and unhurried, rested inside that pause as if it had all the time in the world. The vigil never demanded recognition. It did not ask to be remembered. It passed the way it always did, without ceremony, without instruction, without leaving a mark strong enough to name. In medieval Rome, no one said, "Now the vigil is ending." No one marked the moment when wakefulness tipped back toward rest. The body understood before language did. Shoulders softened, the spine relaxed. Thoughts stopped circling and began to thin, like smoke, losing its shape in still air. Awareness faded gently. People returned to their beds not because they were tired again, but because the night had finished asking for attention. The pause had been long enough. The world had been checked. The fire had been tended. The mind had spoken what it needed to speak, or decided there was nothing worth saying after all. That was enough. Rome accepted this transition without comment. The city did not cling to the vigil. It did not stretch it longer than necessary. It did not romanticize the hour or try to hold it still. The vigil existed to be passed through, not preserved. Sleep came back quietly. Not the deep, weighty sleep of earlier, but something lighter, closer to the surface. A sleep that carried people toward morning without fully removing them from the world. Breathing slowed again. Bodies found warmth where they could. The bench by the hearth stood empty. The room returned to darkness unobserved. Outside, the streets remained silent. Watchmen continued their routes, now fewer, their presence thinning as the night moved on. Even they would rest later. No one was meant to remain awake forever. The vigil had done what it always did. It had reminded people that wakefulness was not an emergency, that the body could open its eyes in the dark without breaking, that the night did not belong only to sleep or fear, but also to quiet presence. Rome did not analyze this. It did not explain it to itself. It lived it. Night after night, year after year, the city moved through this rhythm without anxiety. First sleep, vigil, then rest again. No struggle, no labels, no urgency to correct what was never wrong. Only centuries later would this hour disappear. Only later would people forget that waking could be calm, that darkness could be shared, that rest did not need to be continuous to be complete. Here in medieval Rome, the vigil ended the way it began. Softly, naturally, without anyone noticing the exact moment it slipped away. The city settled back into itself, carrying the quiet of that waking forward, tucked gently inside the remaining hours of night. And Rome waited, unhurried, for dawn. The things Rome did while no one was watching. In medieval Rome, the vigil was not dramatic. It was not philosophical in the way later centuries would imagine it. It was practical, quiet, and slightly uncomfortable in a way that people accepted without complaint. This hour was not for ideas. It was for maintenance. Someone rose from a bed that was never entirely warm. Wool blankets shifted. Straw creaked. A foot searched the floor carefully, already knowing where the cold patches were. No lamps were lit yet. Light cost money. Darkness was free. The first task was almost always the fire. Embers never survived the night on their own. They needed help. A hand reached toward the hearth, feeling for warmth before sight could confirm it. Ash dusted fingers. A small piece of wood was added, never a large one. Large logs were for daylight or emergencies. The vigil demanded restraint. Flames returned slowly, cautiously, as if even fire understood the hour and agreed not to overdo it. This was not comfort. It was survival. Rome did not heat its houses to feel pleasant. It heated them to remain alive. Stone walls held cold the way they held memory. Moisture crept upward from the ground. Breath fogged the air even indoors. Fire was not a luxury. It was a negotiation with the night. Once the hearth was settled, people checked what could not be trusted to remain safe, unattended. Doors were tested not because danger was expected every night, but because expectation was irrelevant. Wood swelled and shrank with dampness. Bars loosened. Latches failed. The city had learned long ago that security was not a permanent state, only a condition that required regular confirmation. A hand pressed against a door. A bar was nudged. A shutter adjusted slightly, not opened, never opened, just touched enough to reassure. Rome did not assume safety. It verified it. Animals were listened for, even in houses where animals were no longer present. Old habits lingered. In courtyards and outbuildings, movement was checked by sound alone. A shift, a breath, the quiet reassurance that nothing had wandered off or collapsed in the dark. And then there were the needs. No one spoke about politely. Buckets were reached for, chamber pots used. The vigil was when the body insisted on honesty. There were no sewers beneath most homes. Nothing disappeared conveniently. Waste remained, waited, and would be dealt with later. Rome did not pretend otherwise. The city survived because it did not pretend. Food was considered next, though rarely eaten. Hunger appeared often during the vigil, a low reminder rather than a demand. Dinner had been early. Hours had passed. The stomach noticed. But eating was a decision weighed carefully. Some nights, a crust of bread was softened with water. Other nights, nothing at all. Food was fuel for labor, not comfort for wakefulness. Eating in the dark felt excessive, even suspicious. The body learned to wait. This restraint was not virtue. It was arithmetic. What Rome did during the vigil rarely involved conversation. Voices were kept low, not because silence was sacred, but because sound traveled. Stone carried noise, walls were thin, privacy was fragile and protected by discretion rather than architecture. When people spoke, it was softly, briefly, about things that could not wait until morning. A worry, a reminder, a name said once, then not again. These were not conversations meant to be remembered, only completed. Many moments passed without speech at all. Hands warmed near the fire. A body leaned against a wall. Someone sat on a bench that existed solely because standing was too tiring and returning to bed felt premature. These were pauses, not activities. Rome understood the value of stopping without calling it rest. This was the hour when nothing impressive happened. No records were kept. No chronicles noted how many doors were checked or how many fires saved from dying. No one praised the vigilance of ordinary households. History does not celebrate tasks that succeed quietly. But Rome depended on them. The city endured not because of grand decisions, but because thousands of small actions were repeated every night without fail. Fires did not go out. Doors stayed closed. Animals remained alive. People woke up, able to work. These actions left no monuments. They left mournings. In the Vigil, Rome was not symbolic. It was operational. The empire of the past was long gone. What remained was a city that functioned because its people accepted responsibility for things no one applauded. Even humor existed here. Faint and dry. A man muttered about the cold. A woman cursed the straw mattress under her breath. Someone blamed the damp for aching joints, as if moisture were a malicious entity with intentions. Rome allowed itself this mild complaint. It asked for nothing more. Eventually the fire settled into a steady glow. The room felt less hostile. The body, having completed its small list of necessary tasks, began to loosen again. There was no signal announcing this shift, no rule, no prayer required. The vigil ended not because time had passed, but because nothing remained to be done. Rome returned to sleep the way it did everything else. Quietly, practically, without needing to explain itself. And because of that, the city lived. Rome did not hurry back to bed. There was often a moment after the tasks were done when no one moved at all. The fire was stable, the door was firm. The house had been acknowledged as if it needed to be seen once before the night could continue safely. In that pause, people simply stood or sat, letting the body decide the next step. This stillness mattered. It was the only time of day when nothing demanded immediate response. Daylight came with obligations. Evening came with preparation. Morning came with urgency. But the vigil, once its small duties were complete, offered something rare in medieval Rome, a stretch of time that belonged to no one else. Some people used it to think, though not in the dramatic sense. Thoughts drifted gently, unstructured, often unfinished. A memory surfaced, a worry tried to form, and then lost interest. The mind wandered like a cat in an empty room, curious but unhurried. Others did nothing at all. They sat near the hearth, hands folded, eyes half closed, not asleep, not fully awake either. This was not meditation. No one named it. It was simply being present without purpose, a state modern language struggles to describe because it produces nothing. Rome allowed this. The city did not measure productivity during the vigil. There were no expectations of usefulness beyond survival. If you had checked the fire in the door, you had done enough for the night. Sometimes a quiet interaction occurred. A child shifted and mumbled. A blanket was pulled higher. A shoulder was touched briefly, reassuringly, without conversation. These gestures were practical, not sentimental. Warmth was shared because warmth mattered. Even couples did not treat the vigil as romance. Intimacy happened, yes, but without performance. It was another form of maintenance, bodies seeking warmth, lives overlapping. Nothing poetic about it unless you were the one freezing. Rome never exaggerated these moments. It did not build stories around them. They were as ordinary as sweeping a floor. And yet this ordinariness kept the city intact. Illness was noticed during the vigil, a cough that lingered too long, a child who felt warmer than usual, a pain that refused to fade with rest. Night revealed what daytime labor drowned out. Decisions were made quietly. Someone would rest tomorrow. Someone would seek help. Someone would endure. The vigil gave space for observation. Outside, the city remained dark. No glow leaked from windows, the way modern cities bleed light into the sky. Rome at night was not illuminated. It was contained. Each house held its own small island of fire, separated from the next by blackness. This separation created humility. You could not see the whole city. You could not monitor others. You focused on what was within reach. Rome survived because people learned the limits of their responsibility and accepted them. As the vigil thinned, the body signaled again. Not sharply, not urgently, just a subtle heaviness. Muscles softened, thoughts slowed further. The bench felt less necessary, the bed felt possible again. Returning to sleep was not an achievement, it was permission. People lay down carefully, aware that the second sleep was different, lighter, more fragile. Dreams came more easily here, closer to waking. The body rested but kept one ear open for morning. Rome slipped back into this sleep without ceremony. No one marked the success of the vigil. No one congratulated themselves for keeping the fire alive or the door closed. These were not accomplishments. They were expectations. And because they were met, the city endured. Rome did not survive on heroics. It survived on nights like this. The vigil never announced its conclusion. It loosened its grip the way cold loosens when the fire has finally taken hold, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually enough that you only noticed once it was gone. The air felt a little less sharp. The stone walls stopped breathing dampness quite so loudly. The house, having been checked and corrected, seemed willing to let go of its tension. This was the moment Rome trusted most. Not the moment of action, but the moment after action, when nothing new appeared to demand attention, when the night, having been acknowledged, stepped back politely. People returned to their beds without ceremony. No prayers were required, though some murmured them anyway, out of habit rather than fear. No effort was made to fall asleep quickly. Sleep was not chased. It was expected to arrive when ready, like morning eventually would. The body curled back into familiar discomfort. Straw pressed where it always pressed. Wool scratched where it always scratched. Yet these sensations no longer mattered. They were known, predictable, almost comforting in their honesty. This was Rome's second silence. Not the heavy silence of the first sleep, when the city dropped abruptly into darkness, but a thinner one, lighter, more porous. A silence that allowed breathing to be heard, dreams to form, and the mind to drift without weight. What Rome had done during the vigil would never be recorded. No chronicler would note how many fires were saved from extinction that night. No ledger would list how many doors were checked, how many animals survived, how many small problems were quietly prevented from becoming disasters. History does not notice what does not go wrong, but Rome knew. The city understood, without articulating it, that survival depended on these invisible acts, on people who woke without panic, who did not mistake darkness for danger, who accepted the pause between sleeps as part of life rather than an interruption. Rome did not survive because it was powerful. It survived because it was attentive. Because when the world stopped being visible, its people did not stop caring for it. They tended what could not be trusted to care for itself. They listened, they adjusted, they fixed what could be fixed and accepted what could not. Then they rested again. By the time the sky began its slow, imperceptible shift toward dawn, most of the city was asleep once more. The vigil had passed through Rome like a quiet visitor, leaving no trace except continuity. Fires waited patiently for morning. Doors remained closed. Bodies rested, restored just enough to rise again. And because of that, the city would wake, not triumphant, not renewed, simply intact. That was enough. That was always enough. And so ends, not with an event, but with a condition, a city still standing, not because it was loud or grand or heroic, but because it had learned how to survive the night through actions so small that no one thought to name them. Rome lived because of what it did when no one was watching. As the vigil moved on, fear lost its sharp edges. It did not vanish. Medieval Rome was too experienced to expect that. But fear softened into something closer to awareness, the kind that keeps a person careful without keeping them awake. The mind learned, over generations, how to hold concern without letting it grow teeth. A sound outside was noted, not imagined into a threat. Footsteps could be a watchman, a creak could be wood, settling in the cold. Even when uncertainty remained, the response was measured. The door had already been checked. The fire was under control. Panic would add nothing useful. This was the discipline of the night. Rome did not try to banish fear through force of belief. Prayer did not erase danger. It framed it. It gave fear a boundary, a place to sit quietly, rather than roam unchecked. When people prayed during the vigil, they were not asking for a world without risk. They were asking for steadiness inside it. Dreams continued to drift through the city as the second sleep approached. Some dreams were gentle, fragments of daily life rearranged softly. Others were darker, pulling from memories of illness, loss, or rumor. Medieval Rome did not assume every dream was divine, but it did assume dreams were worth listening to, at least briefly. Ignoring them entirely felt careless. Still, interpretation was cautious. Dreams suggested. They did not command. A troubling dream might inspire an extra prayer, a small change in habit, a decision to stay closer to home for a few days. It was not a prophecy. It was information, incomplete and imperfect, like everything else available in the dark. The vigil taught this restraint. Fear without restraint led to chaos. Faith without restraint led to denial. Rome lived in the space between them, where belief supported vigilance rather than replacing it. As prayers ended, people did not wait for reassurance to arrive. They trusted the structure they had built for themselves, routine, community, the knowledge that others were awake too, even if unseen, watchmen walking, monks praying, neighbors listening to the same night sounds. No one was truly alone in the dark. This shared awareness mattered more than comfort. It created a city that could sleep in pieces without falling apart. A city that understood night as something to move through, not conquer. When the body leaned back toward rest, prayer did not need a conclusion. It faded naturally, like breath slowing like thoughts loosening their grip, hands relaxed, knees unbent. The floor felt colder again, reminding people that the world had not changed just because they had spoken to it. Sleep returned, light and cautious. The fears of Rome did not follow fully into this sleep. They remained at the edges, watching, waiting, doing what fear does best when kept under control. The mind rested knowing that if something went wrong, waking again was not failure. It was expected. That knowledge was comforting in its own way. Medieval Rome did not dream of perfect safety. It dreamed of continuity, of fires that lasted until morning, of bodies that woke again, of a city that held together through habit rather than hope. Prayer, dreams, and fear all belonged to the Vigil. None of them ruled it. They passed through the night together quietly until the city drifted once more toward rest, carrying just enough awareness to greet the coming dawn. The Vigil did not end with certainty. It ended with acceptance. In medieval Rome, prayer did not guarantee safety. Dreams did not deliver clear answers, and fear did not disappear simply because it was named. What the Vigil offered instead was balance, a way to acknowledge what could go wrong without surrendering to it, a way to speak into the dark without expecting the dark to reply. People returned to sleep, carrying this balance with them. Prayer loosened into memory. Dreams softened into fragments. Fear settled into something quieter, less demanding. The body, having done what it could, allowed itself to rest again without guilt. Waking had not been a failure. It had been part of the design. Rome trusted this rhythm. The city did not expect the night to protect it. It expected itself to remain attentive within the night. Fires were watched, doors were checked. God was addressed. Dreams were noted. Fear was kept close enough to be useful, far enough not to consume. That was the medieval understanding. The Vigil was not a battle between light and darkness. It was a conversation between awareness and rest, between belief and caution, between what could be controlled and what could only be endured. When the second sleep arrived, it did not erase the night's thoughts. It wrapped them gently, postponing judgment until morning. Bodies lay down knowing that dawn would not arrive because they worried correctly or prayed perfectly, but because dawn always arrived. Rome slept again. Not because it was fearless, not because it was certain, but because it had learned how to live with uncertainty without letting it rule the night. And that was enough to carry the city forward, one quiet vigil at a time. Prayer, dreams, and fear in medieval Rome. In medieval Rome, the vigil was not empty time. It was time that listened. This was the hour when the city stopped pretending it was fully in control. Daylight allowed confidence. Work created rhythm. Habit created the illusion that tomorrow would arrive because it always had. But the vigil interrupted that comfort gently without cruelty, reminding people that much of life remained unseen. And so people prayed. Night prayer was quieter than daytime devotion. There were no crowds, no bells calling bodies together. Prayer during the vigil belonged to individuals and households. It happened close to the hearth, beside sleeping children, near walls that held centuries of damp and memory. Knees touched stone floors. Hands folded not to impress God, but to steady the self. Confession lived here too. Not the formal kind spoken to priests under vaulted ceilings, but the private kind whispered into darkness. Small regrets, sharp words remembered too late, promises made again without confidence they would hold. Medieval Rome did not expect moral perfection in the middle of the night. It expected humility. Many believed that God listened more closely at midnight, not because heaven worked on a schedule, but because the world was quieter, fewer distractions, fewer demands. Midnight felt like a thinning of noise, a narrowing of distance. Words spoken softly felt heavier, more likely to land somewhere meaningful. Whether this belief was theological truth or psychological comfort mattered less than the effect. People felt heard, and feeling heard mattered. Reading followed prayer when light allowed it. A single candle, a stub of oil lamp. Scripture read slowly, not to analyze, but to calm. Psalms returned again and again because they were familiar. Reading in the Vigil was not about discovery. It was about reassurance. The words did not need to surprise, they needed to steady. Then there were dreams. Medieval Rome paid attention to dreams, especially those that came after the first sleep. These dreams were thought to be clearer, closer to waking, closer to truth. People remembered them more easily. A dream of water, a dream of fire, a dream of falling. These were not always interpreted as prophecy, but rarely dismissed entirely. Dreams were considered messages, though not always clear ones. They suggested rather than commanded. A troubling dream might lead to an extra prayer, a day of caution, a delay in travel. Dreams were not instructions. They were signals, imperfect and incomplete, like everything else available in the dark. Fear lived beside prayer and dreams. Rome feared real things. Thieves were common. Fire was constant danger. One spark could erase a neighborhood before dawn. Disease lingered in memory, especially plague, which arrived without warning and left without explanation. These fears were not imagined. They were practical. Even demons had their place. Not always as literal creatures with claws and wings, but as explanations for sudden illness, night terrors, or unaccountable dread. Darkness gave imagination room to move, but medieval Rome did not let imagination rule. Fear was acknowledged, not indulged. The response was not panic. Doors were checked, fires were watched, prayers were said, habits were followed because habits worked. Rome did not expect faith to replace vigilance. It expected faith to coexist with it. This balance defined the medieval night. Fear sharpened attention without overwhelming it. Belief offered structure without denying reality. The vigil was not a battlefield between heaven and terror. It was a space where both were acknowledged and kept in proportion. As the hour passed, fear softened. Not because danger vanished, but because nothing had gone wrong. The door remained closed, the fire behaved, the body remained intact. This quiet success mattered. It reminded people that vigilance did not always require escalation. Prayer slowed, reading ended. Dreams faded back into fragments. Rome did not demand answers from the night. It demanded Preparedness. When people returned to sleep, they carried less tension with them. Fear remained, but it rested now, contained. The second sleep arrived lighter, closer to morning, filled with softer dreams or none at all. The vigil had done its work. It had allowed Rome to face uncertainty without collapsing under it, to acknowledge fear without surrendering control, to speak to God without expecting guarantees. And because of that, the city slept again. Not fearless, not certain, just steady. That was how medieval Rome survived the night. And as the vigil loosened its hold, medieval Rome did not rush away from what it had just acknowledged. There was often a final quiet moment, softer than prayer, quieter than fear, when nothing more needed to be said. Hands that had folded slowly relaxed, knees that had touched cold stone lifted again. The body understood, before thought did, that the night had offered what it could. This was not relief. It was alignment. Dreams that followed were different now, less urgent, less symbolic. They drifted rather than insisted, faces blurred, places softened. Meanings, if they existed at all, waited patiently for daylight to decide whether they mattered. Rome did not chase them. Morning would sort what night merely suggested. Fear did not vanish when sleep returned. It settled like a watchful animal curling near the hearth, awake enough to notice trouble, calm enough not to startle at shadows. This was the correct posture for the dark. Not blindness, not alarm, awareness without tension. The city rested this way every night, not because it believed danger would pass it by, but because it knew exhaustion helped no one. Rome understood that survival required rest as much as caution. You could not guard a fire forever without letting your eyes close. You could not fear constantly without eventually becoming careless. So the city slept again. Faith remained nearby, not loud, not demanding. Dreams lingered at the edges, not begging for interpretation. Fear stayed seated, not pacing. The vigil receded, having done what it was meant to do. When dawn eventually arrived, it would not feel miraculous. It would feel expected. Another morning earned quietly, not through heroics, but through balance. Prayer, dreams, fear all acknowledged, none obeyed, blindly. That was the medieval rhythm. And Rome, steady and unremarkable in its wisdom, followed it night after night, letting darkness exist without letting it rule. As the final moments of the vigil slipped away, medieval Rome did not mark them with meaning. There was no clear line where prayer ended, where dreams lost their power, where fear officially stood down. These things simply softened together, blending back into the quiet background of the night. The city did not demand closure. It trusted the process. People lay down again knowing that nothing more could be done until morning. Doors had been checked. Fires had been steadied. Words had been spoken where words helped. Silence had been allowed where it was better. That was the end of the vigil's work. Rome did not expect God to remove danger. It expected itself to remain attentive. It did not expect dreams to explain the future. It expected them to remind people that the mind continues working even when the body rests. It did not expect fear to disappear. It expected fear to remain useful rather than destructive. This balance defined the medieval night. Prayer offered orientation. Dreams offered reflection. Fear offered caution. None of them ruled alone. Together they shaped a city capable of resting without becoming careless. When the second sleep took hold, it did so gently. Breathing slowed, muscles released. The mind drifted toward lighter dreams or none at all. The vigil had done what it was meant to do and stepped aside without ceremony. Rome slept again. Not because the night was safe, not because the answers were clear, but because the city had learned how to live with uncertainty without letting it steal rest. And that, in medieval Rome, was the quiet victory that carried the city toward dawn. Those who stayed awake while Rome slept. Rome never slept all at once. Even in its quietest hours, even when most bodies had folded back into the second sleep, the city remained lightly awake through a scattered few. Not because it wanted to be vigilant, not because it believed itself important, but because some roles could not surrender to darkness at the same time as everyone else. These people did not break the rhythm of the night, they completed it. First were the monks. While households drifted between sleeps, monasteries followed a different clock, one that did not belong to the sun or the body, but to rule and repetition. At midnight, bells rang softly for matins, not loud enough to wake the city, only enough to wake those who had already agreed to be woken. Monks rose without complaint. Stone floors were cold. Robes were thin. The walk to the chapel was familiar enough to navigate without thinking. Prayer at this hour was not emotional. It was disciplined. Psalms were chanted slowly, voices blending into something steady and unremarkable. This was not passion. It was continuity. They prayed not because they felt inspired, but because prayer at midnight had always happened and would continue to happen long after they were gone. In this way, monasteries acted like anchors in the dark, holding time steady while the rest of Rome drifted in and out of sleep. Then there were the Watchmen. They moved through the city quietly, carrying lanterns that barely pushed back the dark. Their job was not heroism, it was repetition. Walk the same streets, check the same doors, listen for the same sounds, make sure no fire had grown ambitious, make sure no one lay forgotten in an alley. The watchman did not expect gratitude. Most people never saw him. That was the point. If he was noticed, something had already gone wrong. His presence allowed others to sleep without fully surrendering awareness. Rome trusted the watchman not because he could stop everything, but because he reduced the chance of surprise. And then there were the bakers. Their vigil began when others ended theirs. Dough did not wait for dawn. Bread required time, warmth, patience. Bakers rose during the vigil, hands moving in the glow of ovens, while the rest of the city lay dark and quiet. They worked because morning demanded it. Flour dusted the air. Ovens roared. Sweat formed despite the cold. This was labor without audience, work done for people who would never think about the hands that fed them. Bakers did not resent this. It was simply how the city functioned. Rome woke because someone had already been awake. Not all wakefulness was chosen. The poor often stayed awake because sleep was not generous to them. Pain interrupted rest. Hunger did not respect rhythms. Old injuries ached more sharply in the cold. Thin blankets offered little relief. The vigil stretched longer for these bodies, not because they wanted awareness, but because the body refused to cooperate. The elderly, too, found the night difficult. Sleep became lighter with age. Thoughts lingered. Memories surfaced, uninvited. For them, the vigil was less a pause and more a long corridor of waiting. Rome did not romanticize this. There was no poetry in pain or hunger. The city accepted that not all wakefulness was productive or meaningful. Some people were simply awake because the night was unkind. Still, they belonged to the rhythm. Rome did not demand uniformity. It did not require everyone to sleep or wake at the same moment. What it required was alignment, a shared understanding of night as something to move through together, even if differently. Some prayed, some patrolled, some worked, some endured. The city did not separate these roles into higher or lower meanings. Each existed because the night required it. Together they formed a quiet network of awareness that allowed Rome to continue breathing, even while most eyes were closed. Rome did not sleep in one way, but it slept in one rhythm, and because of that, the night passed without tearing the city apart. And as the night thinned toward its later hours, these wakeful lives continued without drawing attention to themselves. The monks returned to their cells after matins, not triumphant, not uplifted, simply obedient to a rhythm older than any one of them. Some slept again, some did not. The rule allowed for both. What mattered was that the prayer had been spoken, the chant had carried through the dark, and the night had been acknowledged in common. The watchmen slowed their steps. By now they knew which streets would remain quiet and which corners deserved another glance. They listened more than they looked. A change in sound mattered more than light ever could. A door that creaked differently. A fire that crackled too eagerly. Their work was not dramatic. It was preventive. Success meant nothing happened. The bakers worked on. By the later vigil hours, dough had risen, loaves were shaped. The city's future breakfast took form in silence. The smell of bread would soon drift into streets that were still dark, hinting at morning before it arrived. Rome would wake hungry, as it always did, and bread would already be waiting. Those who stayed awake from pain or age did not mark time at all. For them, the night did not move in chapters. It stretched. Joints burned. Hunger gnawed. Sleep came in fragments, if at all. They listened to the city breathing around them and waited, not for meaning but for relief, or simply for light. Rome made room for this too. It did not pretend that its rhythm was gentle for everyone. It only insisted that the rhythm existed, that no one was entirely outside it, even those who suffered through its longest hours. What held the city together was not synchronized sleep, but shared expectation. Everyone knew what night was for. Everyone knew when it would end. Dawn did not need to be announced. It arrived whether you had slept or not, whether you had prayed, patrolled, baked, or endured. And when it came, these waking lives folded back into the city seamlessly. Monks blended into daylight duties. Watchmen returned home to rest. Bakers opened shutters. The poor and the old rose slowly, carrying the night in their bodies. Rome did not pause to thank them. It did not need to. Their wakefulness had already done its work. This was the quiet truth of the medieval night. Rome did not depend on a single kind of sleeper or a single kind of watcher. It depended on overlap, on staggered awareness, on the fact that while most people rested, someone else was always awake, not as a hero but as a necessity. The city slept, unevenly, imperfectly, humanly, yet it moved through the night intact. And when the sky finally lightened and the first sounds of morning returned, Rome rose again, not knowing exactly who had stayed awake, only knowing that the city had been carried through the dark once more. That was enough. That was always enough. As the last hours of night passed, Rome did not separate those who had slept from those who had not. Morning did not reward wakefulness, nor did it punish rest. It simply arrived, indifferent to who had prayed, patrolled, baked, endured, or drifted between shallow dreams. The city absorbed all of them without distinction. Monks folded midnight prayer into daylight labor, as if nothing unusual had happened. Watchmen slipped home quietly, boots leaving no mark worth noticing. Bakers wiped flour from their hands and opened their doors to customers who never asked how long they had been awake. The poor and the elderly moved slowly, carrying the night in their bones, unseen and unremarked. Rome did not record these differences. What mattered was not who slept, but that the city continued. This was the hidden strength of the medieval night. Rome did not rely on everyone doing the same thing at the same time. It relied on enough people doing what needed to be done when it was needed. Some prayed while others watched. Some worked while others endured. Awareness was spread, not centralized. Because of this, the night never fully claimed the city. There was always a light somewhere, a step on stone, a hand kneading dough, a voice murmuring prayer, a body shifting in pain. These small, scattered moments of wakefulness stitched the darkness together, preventing it from becoming absolute. Rome slept in fragments, but lived as a whole. No single role was heroic. No single person was essential. What mattered was the pattern they formed together, a rhythm that allowed rest without surrender, vigilance without exhaustion. When dawn came, it revealed nothing remarkable, just a city still standing, still breathing, still able to begin again. That was the success of the night. Rome did not sleep in one way, but it slept in one rhythm, and that rhythm carried it forward, quietly, into another day. The vigil as the most private hour, and the second sleep before dawn. If the first sleep belonged to the body and the early vigil belonged to responsibility, then this later portion of the night belonged to something far quieter and far more human. This was the most private hour Rome ever had. Not private in the modern sense of solitude or isolation, but private in the sense that no one expected anything from you. No work waited, no neighbor watched, no public role needed to be performed. The city, for a brief stretch of time, stopped asking its people to be useful, and people noticed. This was when couples talked. Not formally, not seriously at first. Words drifted out in fragments, almost accidentally, as if testing whether it was safe to speak at all. A question half formed. A worry mentioned lightly, then returned to more honestly. The kind of conversation that could not survive daylight, where interruptions were constant and roles too rigid. In this hour, voices stayed low, not out of fear, but out of intimacy. The darkness wrapped around words and softened them. A husband admitted uncertainty. A wife spoke about exhaustion without needing to justify it. These were not dramatic confessions. They were small truths that needed darkness to exist. Many decisions were shaped here. Marriage was discussed here, not announced, not negotiated publicly, but considered quietly. A daughter's future, a son's prospects, whether a match was bearable, whether affection might grow, whether survival outweighed desire. Rome did not romanticize marriage, but it did not treat it casually either. These conversations required time without witnesses. Money came up too. Not numbers exactly, but anxiety. Whether grain would last, whether debts could be delayed another season, whether a bad harvest could be endured without selling something that could never be replaced. These worries felt heavier at night, but also clearer. Without the noise of day, they could be examined honestly, without pretending optimism. No one solved everything during the vigil, but people aligned themselves with reality. That mattered. This was also when people worried about the future in a way that did not demand immediate answers. The mind was alert, but not rushed. Possibilities could exist without needing resolution. Rome became thoughtful rather than reactive. And because there was no work to be done, these thoughts were not interruptions. They were allowed. This is why the vigil was so deeply human. No one was performing a role, no one was proving anything. People were simply present with each other or with themselves in a way the day never permitted. The city, stripped of its functions, revealed its inner life. Eventually, though, the body spoke again. Not urgently, not sharply, just a subtle pull. Muscles softened. Eyelids grew heavy without insistence. No one needed to decide to sleep. The body returned to the bed the way a tide returns to shore, quietly and without debate. This was the second sleep. It was lighter than the first. Dreams here were closer to waking, more fragile, sometimes remembered, sometimes not. The body rested but kept one foot in the world. It knew morning was coming. This sleep did not repair the body so much as prepare it. Breathing slowed, but not deeply. Muscles released, but not fully. The mind drifted, but remained capable of waking without shock. This was not escape, it was transition. Rome trusted this sleep. It did not expect it to be profound. It expected it to be sufficient. This was the sleep that carried people into labor, into fields and workshops and kitchens and streets. It delivered them not refreshed, perhaps, but intact, oriented, ready enough. The vigil had allowed truth. The second sleep allowed continuity. Together they brought Rome into the morning not as an idea, not as a symbol, but as a collection of tired, thoughtful, functioning human beings. This was when Rome was most itself. Not at noon, under banners and noise, not at dusk, under bells and obligation. But here, in the quiet stretch before dawn, when the city rested lightly, holding just enough awareness to rise again. And when morning finally arrived, Rome did not wake suddenly. It emerged, carrying with it the words spoken in the dark, the worries left unresolved but acknowledged, and the calm understanding that life would continue, one ordinary day at a time. As the second sleep deepened just enough to be called rest, Rome loosened its grip on the night. Breathing settled into a steady rhythm, slower than waking, lighter than the first sleep. Bodies shifted once or twice, finding positions that would hold until morning without complaint. The city no longer listened outward, it turned inward, conserving what remained. This sleep did not erase thought. It softened it. Ideas that had surfaced during the vigil drifted without urgency. Worries about harvests, debts, marriages, illness did not disappear, but they stopped demanding attention. The mind accepted that answers would belong to daylight. For now, it was enough to have named the questions. Rome understood this distinction. There was a time for solving and a time for carrying. The second sleep was for carrying things forward gently without letting them press too hard against the chest. Dreams came and went, often thin, sometimes fragmented, occasionally peaceful. Many were forgotten by morning, and that was fine. Not everything needed to be remembered to be useful. The body prepared itself quietly. Muscles rested in a way that allowed them to rise again. Joints loosened slightly. The cold was still present, but familiar now, less hostile. The fire burned low but steady, as if aware that it, too, only needed to last a little longer. Outside, the darkness changed almost imperceptibly. Black softened into deep blue. The stars thinned. The city did not notice immediately. There were no clocks to announce this shift. The body sensed it first, the way it always did. A subtle readiness replaced heaviness. Sleep became shallower, closer to waking. Rome was turning toward the day. This was not a jolt. It was a gradual alignment. The second sleep did not end abruptly. It released people slowly, allowing them to surface without shock. When eyes opened, they did so calmly. When bodies sat up, they did so knowing exactly where they were. This mattered. Rome did not wake confused, it woke oriented. The vigil had done its work, conversations had been had, worries acknowledged, rest accepted without guilt. The city did not need inspiration to begin again. It needed only continuity, and that is what the second sleep provided. It carried Rome forward, not renewed, not transformed, but capable. Capable of labor, capable of endurance, capable of another ordinary day that would not be remembered, but would be lived fully enough to matter. In this way, the vigil and the second sleep worked together. One allowed honesty, the other allowed function. Together they shaped a city that could face daylight without having to pretend it was untouched by night. Rome rose from this sleep, not as an empire, not as an idea, but as people. Tired, thoughtful, steady people, stepping back into work with the quiet knowledge that the night had been survived, not through struggle, but through rhythm. And that rhythm, unremarkable and deeply human, carried Rome into the morning once more. As the second sleep reached its final stretch, Rome no longer belonged to the night, not yet to the day either. It existed in between. This was the gentlest state the city ever knew. Not awake enough to worry, not asleep enough to forget. Bodies rested lightly, like hands placed on water without breaking the surface. If someone stirred, it was without alarm. If someone woke, it was without confusion. The mind knew where it was. The body knew what would come next. This sleep was not deep, and Rome did not ask it to be. It was enough to loosen stiffness without erasing fatigue, enough to calm thoughts without silencing them, enough to prepare muscles, breath, and attention for the demands waiting just beyond the horizon. Rome did not seek comfort here. It sought readiness. Dreams in this hour were fragile. They drifted close to waking, often dissolving the moment eyes opened, faces blurred, places shifted. Many dreams were forgotten entirely, leaving behind only a faint emotional residue, a sense of calm, or a quiet unease with no clear source. Rome accepted this too. Meaning was not required from every experience. The body was learning how to rise, breathing adjusted, blood moved more quickly. The cold felt sharper again, reminding sleepers that the bed would soon be left behind. Somewhere a fire sighed and settled. Somewhere else, a foot shifted on straw. These were not disturbances, they were signals. Morning was approaching. Rome did not need clocks or bells to know this. It sensed it the way animals do, the way fields do, the way stone does when light begins to change. The second sleep loosened its hold naturally, allowing people to surface without resistance. When eyes opened, there was no shock. No one leapt from bed. No one cursed the night for ending too soon. The second sleep had done what it was meant to do. It had carried people to the edge of the day without draining them of what little strength they had left. This was how Rome prepared for labor. Not with motivation, not with ambition, but with quiet alignment. The conversations of the vigil lingered but did not overwhelm. The worries discussed remained unresolved but less sharp. Decisions were not made yet, but directions had been sensed. This was enough clarity for a morning that would demand movement, not reflection. Rome rose like this every day, not refreshed, not inspired, but capable. And that capability mattered more than comfort ever could. As people finally left their beds, the city emerged from the second sleep carrying something subtle but essential, a sense of continuity, the knowledge that night had been faced honestly and left without panic. That words had been spoken where needed, and silence allowed where it was better. Rome stepped into daylight as itself, a city shaped not only by monuments and memory, but by these quiet hours when no one watched, when no work was demanded, when the most human parts of life were allowed to exist without explanation. This was the gift of the vigil. This was the purpose of the second sleep. They did not make Rome heroic, they made it survivable. And that was enough to bring the city once more into mourning. When Rome forgot how to sleep. Rome did not lose the vigil all at once. It faded. Not through a decree, not through philosophy, not because anyone decided the old rhythm was wrong. It disappeared the way habits disappear when the world quietly changes underneath them, while people are busy adjusting to something else. For centuries, night in Rome had been long, dark, and unavoidable. Darkness shaped behavior. It dictated when people stopped working, when they rested, when they woke again. Sleep bent itself around the night because the night was immovable. Then the night began to shrink. In the 18th century, gaslight appeared, At first, it was unimpressive, flickering, unreliable, expensive. But it was bright enough to change one crucial thing: visibility. Streets no longer dissolved completely after sunset. Evening gained shape. Time extended. People stayed awake a little longer, not because they wanted to rebel against nature, but because they could now see their hands. Conversations stretched. Work crept forward. The boundary between day and night softened, and with it, the need to surrender early to darkness. The vigil did not vanish yet, but it began to feel less necessary. Then came electric light in the 19th century, and the change accelerated. Night no longer demanded respect. It could be pushed back with a switch. Darkness became optional, almost suspicious, something to be corrected rather than endured. Rome's nights grew shorter, not in hours, but in meaning. Sleep adapted under pressure. When evenings stretched later and mornings stayed fixed, the old rhythm no longer fit. 14 hours of darkness collapsed into 8, sometimes less. There was no longer space for 2 sleeps and a quiet hour between them. The body's natural pause became inconvenient, so it was removed. Sleep was compressed into a single block, continuous, uninterrupted, efficient. The vigil, once expected, became a disruption. Waking at midnight was no longer normal. It was labeled a problem, a disorder, a failure to sleep correctly. Rome forgot that waking had once been part of rest. Modern life reinforced this forgetting. Work schedules hardened. Clocks replaced bodies. Productivity demanded predictability. You were expected to sleep when told, wake when told, and function regardless of how your body felt about it. The night was no longer a shared experience. It became an obstacle. In this new Rome, waking in the dark felt lonely. There were no watchmen passing, no monks chanting, no bakers already working in quiet solidarity. Streets were empty not because people rested, but because they were supposed to be unconscious. Silence changed its meaning. It stopped being communal and became isolating. A person awake at 2 a.m. was no longer on time. They were alone with a glowing clock and the creeping suspicion that something was wrong with them. The vigil did not fit into this world. It had no productivity, no measurable outcome, no place in schedules designed around efficiency, so it vanished from memory. Rome gained light, comfort, and longer lives. It gained safety and convenience unimaginable to its medieval self. But it lost that quiet hour when nothing was demanded, when waking was allowed without explanation, when humanity sat gently between sleeps. Modern Rome does not have a vigil. It has insomnia. And the difference is not biological. It is cultural. The body still remembers, it still wakes sometimes, ready for a pause that no longer exists. But the world around it offers no framework, no permission, no shared rhythm to hold that moment. So, the wakefulness feels wrong. Rome did not become worse, it became different. And in becoming different, it forgot something subtle but profound, that sleep was once flexible, patient, forgiving, shaped by darkness rather than imposed against it. The vigil did not die. It was crowded out. And modern Rome sleeps on, unaware of the rhythm it left behind, carrying a faint echo of midnight wakefulness without knowing where it came from or what it was once for. The loss was quiet enough that no one thought to mourn it. Rome did not wake one morning and realize it had forgotten how to sleep. There was no announcement, no resistance, no sense that something essential had slipped away. People simply adapted. They always had. The city had survived emperors, plagues, invasions, collapses. Changing the way it slept felt small by comparison. And yet something shifted deep beneath the surface. Without the vigil, the night lost its middle. It became a tunnel rather than a landscape. You entered sleep at one end and were expected to emerge at the other without interruption. Any pause along the way felt like a malfunction. The old acceptance vanished. Waking in the dark, once ordinary, became unsettling. A person opening their eyes at 2 a.m. no longer felt aligned with the city. There were no shared sounds, no sense of others moving through the same hour. The monk no longer prayed. The watchman no longer passed. The baker no longer began his work, while the street slept. Rome was dark not because it rested together, but because everyone had been instructed to disappear at once. This kind of darkness felt different. It pressed inward rather than holding space. Silence became empty instead of communal. A glowing clock replaced the hearth, counting minutes instead of marking presence. Time, once fluid at night, became rigid and accusatory. Why are you awake? What is wrong? Why aren't you sleeping correctly? These were new questions. Medieval Rome never asked them. The modern city answered wakefulness with remedies, pills, advice, schedules, instructions on how to force the body back into a pattern it had not chosen. The old pause between sleeps was reframed as a problem to be solved rather than a moment to be inhabited. Rome learned to distrust its own rhythms. Artificial light trained the eyes to ignore darkness. Work trained the body to ignore fatigue. Clocks trained the mind to override instinct. The night became something to conquer efficiently rather than move through patiently. And yet the body did not forget. It still wakes sometimes quietly without drama as it always has. It still asks for a pause, a moment without demand, a small space where thought can wander and settle before returning to rest. But modern Rome offers no such space. There is no vigil to step into, no shared understanding that this hour belongs to something other than productivity or sleep. So the pause feels wrong, heavy, lonely. People lie awake fighting a rhythm that once sustained them. The city no longer recognizes this state. Where medieval Rome saw balance, modern Rome sees failure. And so the vigil remains only as a ghost, a biological memory without cultural permission, a habit written into the body but erased from daily life. Rome did not choose to forget how to sleep. It simply built a world where remembering no longer fit. Light made the night smaller. Schedules made sleep rigid. Efficiency left no room for pause. And in gaining control over darkness, the city lost the quiet hour that once made it gentle. The vigil ended not with destruction, but with replacement. Rome learned a new way to sleep. And something human, unmeasurable, and deeply familiar slipped away with it, unnoticed, into the artificial glow of a night that no longer waits. And so the vigil did not end with resistance. It ended with silence, not the shared silence of medieval Rome, filled with footsteps, prayers, breath, and fire, but a different kind of quiet, one that expects the body to disappear completely until morning. The night was no longer something to inhabit. It was something to get through. Modern Rome did not notice the difference. It gained light and lost darkness. It gained efficiency and lost pause. It gained uninterrupted sleep and lost the permission to wake without fear. The old rhythm, once shaped by the night itself, was replaced by a rule imposed from outside the body. Waking at midnight became a failure rather than a phase. The city no longer offered a place for the half-awake mind to rest. There was no vigil to step into, no hour that belonged to listening rather than doing. So people lay awake alone, convinced that something had gone wrong, when in truth something familiar was simply unrecognized. Rome forgot how to hold the night gently. The lights stayed on, the clocks kept counting. Sleep was compressed, controlled, and expected to behave, and the quiet hour that once made space for humanity was crowded out by brightness and obligation. The vigil did not vanish because it was useless. It vanished because it no longer fit. And with that, Rome closed a chapter of its nights, carrying forward a city brighter, faster, more controlled, but a little less patient with the rhythms that had once carried it safely through the dark. Rome slept in pieces, and so did we. Medieval Rome did not sleep to decorate history. It did not sleep to become poetic, symbolic, or memorable. It slept because bodies needed rest, because darkness demanded pause, because life could not be sustained on effort alone. Rome slept in pieces not out of confusion, but out of alignment with the night it lived inside. Its rhythm was biological before it was cultural. Sleep came, then loosened. Wakefulness arrived without panic. Silence was shared. Tasks were done quietly. Words were spoken when daylight made them impossible. Then sleep returned, lighter, patient, just enough to carry the body into morning. This was not broken sleep. It was complete sleep spread gently across the night. Waking in the dark was once ordinary. It was useful. It was human. It allowed attention without urgency, reflection without pressure, connection without performance. Rome's people did not fear these hours. They knew how to hold them, how to move through them, how to let them pass without struggle. Only later did we forget. Today, when someone wakes at 2 or 3 in the morning, the feeling is different. The room feels empty rather than shared. The silence feels accusatory rather than calm. A clock glows, counting minutes, asking questions no one in medieval Rome would have understood. Why are you awake? What is wrong? Why aren't you sleeping correctly? But perhaps nothing is wrong at all. Perhaps the body is remembering a rhythm older than schedules, older than switches and screens, and uninterrupted expectations. Perhaps it is asking for a pause it once knew how to inhabit. If you wake in the middle of the night, you may not be broken. You may simply be out of sync with a modern rule that forgot how flexible sleep once was. Rome did not lose sleep. It did not fail at rest. It did not become insomniac. It simply learned to sleep differently. And somewhere beneath the light and the clocks and the insistence on continuous rest, the older rhythm still lingers quietly, waiting to be recognized, not as a problem, but as a memory. This has been late night history. If the night feels long, you are not alone. And if wakefulness visits you gently, you do not need to chase it away. Rome once lived there too, and so the night comes to a close, not with an answer, but with recognition. Medieval Rome did not sleep to impress history. It did not arrange its nights to look orderly from the future. It slept the way bodies naturally sleep. When darkness is long, light is rare, and life depends on listening inward as much as outward. It slept in pieces because that was how humans rested best inside that world. Waking in the night was once normal. It was useful. It was deeply human. It allowed space for care, for quiet work, for prayer, for fear that did not spiral, for conversations that daylight could not hold. It gave the body permission to pause without labeling itself broken. Rome survived not because it conquered the night, but because it moved through it gently. If you wake at 2 or 3 in the morning today, staring into darkness that feels too quiet or too empty, it does not necessarily mean something is wrong with you. It may mean something very old is stirring, a rhythm your body remembers, even if your world no longer does. Rome did not lose its sleep. It simply learned to sleep another way. And perhaps on nights like this, when the world is quiet and demands nothing, we are not failing at rest at all. Perhaps we are just touching a memory of how humans once moved through the dark without fear. Thank you for staying with this night, for listening slowly, and for letting history breathe instead of rush. This has been Late Night History. Rest gently wherever you are, and when morning comes, may it arrive without urgency. Good night.